Do you think we
yeah.
do?
Am I just the one? Oh no. Oh, Happy. What period is this? Sorry. Oh, we. Yeah.
That works.
So, presentation. He first came to late during the First World War. During the time, he was a platoon commander, but he got injured very quickly, very early on in the war. And during his time in hospital, you could already tell that he was developing this kind of, you'll see it throughout the presentation, he develops a very anti-Anglo, anti-American kind of mindset. He was very bitter at the fact that he believed the English troops were very slow. And then after he recovered and went back to combat, his unit would be kind of, commemorated for their kind of the intelligence that they collected, because they would crawl through no man's land, and then they'd listen in on the Germans' conversation, pull back, and he received the Croix de Guerre, the War Cross, just a medal. But then he would get captured in the First World War, and in the 32 months he was in prison, he would try and escape 5 times, one of which he would dress up as a maid or nurse. He would try to fool the Germans and look out that failed, would be punished for that. And then after the war, he came back to France. He lectured about war, and he went through college, or I think it was the École de Guerre, which was like a war school. And he would he'd be quite arrogant, and this meant that his kind of mentor or lecturer would give him assez bien grade, which is good enough, which meant that he would get a very low roll in the military. And then actually Marshal Pétain, who would become an adversary to him later on, he actually gave him a job as his ghostwriter. So de Gaulle would write books on theory of war and battle and stuff, and Pétain would take all the credit. He was also a very early proponent of armored warfare, which is really important, because there was a huge divide at the time between the kind of old style generals like Pétain and the newer the youth, who believed that the kind of technological advances of the 20th century were the next big thing when it came to warfare. So he would advocate very heavily for that. And this would attract the attention of Griffin, who was the Prime Minister of France. He would become the Prime Minister of France at the beginning of the Second World War, and this developed their relationship. And it meant that later on he would be appointed a government minister by him, and it meant that he would have some say over France's actions during the war. His specific position was to coordinate the French army with the British, and he flew to meet Winston Churchill on the 9th of June 1940, and initially they drafted plans to combine the French forces and the British forces to create a stronger army that would be able to oppose the German invasion of France at the time. But the succession of Pétain to the basically dictator of France meant that they had to cancel those plans. But they were really important because the French Navy was a huge question, because the British obviously didn't want to fire on their former allies' navy. They also didn't want to let it fall into the hands of the Germans, so it's quite a delicate issue. We're really trying to solve it. but nothing really came of it. It's too late. So the first main way people know him is as the leader of Free France, the French resistance. So Churchill would, so after de Gaulle came back to England, retreating from France, Churchill would offer him broadcasting time with the BBC, because the same day Pétain had given his radio broadcast announcing that France would become this allied state with Germany essentially. And Churchill and de Gaulle thought it best that they kind of counter that with their own broadcast from the real French state. And this brings you to the appeal of the 18th of June, which is a very famous speech by de Gaulle. Pretty much every French person would know this speech. But the thing is, actually during the time, not many people would have actually heard this speech, so its fame is possibly overblown because it didn't actually have that much interest as the written speech. But then during his time in Britain, his relationship with the Allied powers was sour. And then there are a number of reasons for this, because de Gaulle was definitely very he wasn't racist, but he was very anti-English and anti-American. He wasn't a fan of the Allies. So during his childhood, colonial disputes in Africa meant that there was already an anti-English sentiment in France. And he believes that the Allies never treated France as an ally because they were never consulted on the provisions that the English and the Americans would make. And in fact, Roosevelt would support an opponent of de Gaulle to become the leader of Free France, who was he was a yes man for the United States, and this meant that their relationship was very bitter. And he also made sure that de Gaulle would be excluded from the conferences like Yalta and Potsdam because he thought that there was no need for him to be there. And also, de Gaulle's plane, he was taking a trip through England during the war at some point, and his plane got sabotaged, and he actually thought that the Allies had orchestrated the attack, even though that publicly people blamed the Germans. But he was very aware that their relationship was awful. I think that kind of describes his relationship with so after the liberation of France, Roosevelt planned for an Allied military government of occupied territories. And this would be implemented to France, but this is really unpopular even with other Allied leaders. The Foreign Secretary of the United States, other members of government were against this. It was Roosevelt's idea. So that got defeated quite quickly. Eisenhower actually helped a lot. The future president of the United States, the top general of the United States. At the time, he was a supporter of de Gaulle, and he tried to help him get into power. He allowed the French military to walk on into Paris first to kind of symbolize that that they were the people who were going to be running the show next, rather than the United States. And then for a brief period, there were dangers of the resistance kind of uprising, because there were many resistance groups, militias who had lots of arms. And after the Germans left, these were the people who had all the power essentially. And a big faction was the communists in this, but the French resistance. And de Gaulle made sure to kind of cut down on their power, telling them they have to join the French army or they have to lower their weapons. And eventually, he would kind of break up the resistance. But there was a good chance that after the liberation of France, that they would make a complete invasion takeover. So I mentioned he was excluded from the major conferences between the big three, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And he would blame these leaders for the political turmoil that Europe would be placed in after the Second World War because of this. However, when the French kind of managed to recuperate parts of the army, when they invaded through some Germany through the Rhine, it meant that they were allowed to take a slice of Germany that you see in West Germany on the maps where you see Germany's split. This this also was really important for France because it meant that they were able to be one of the founding members of the United Nations. It also meant that they came to sit in the UN Security Council, which they still have today, and it gives them a lot of power on the world stage. So it kind of just goes to show de Gaulle's early influence of the world. And then, so after he became the leader of liberated France, he would step down eventually. And then throughout the 1950s, France was basically starting to fail because its new constitution was pretty poorly written. There were lots of flaws there. So the main thing was decolonialization was the main factor in downfall of the Republic. Mainly the Algerian question, because Algeria was like the most important colony that France had. There were many of these French settlers called the Pieds Noirs, and they like saw Algeria as home, and it was basically like a second country for France. So the fact that there was a group of people in Algeria who wanted independence was like very important. Like it was a very big issue for France, and the government at the time just could not solve this question. It had gone on for years, because I believe the first Algerian war or something, 1954, about 1958 to 59. So like no progress had been made. And at the time, the French president René Coty, he told Parliament that the nation was on the brink of a civil war, and he made this lovely address to de Gaulle commemorating his former glory and asking him to please return. And de Gaulle, of course, he accepted, but on the condition that the constitution would be introduced, creating the presidency, what we have in France today, with 7-term limits. And he also requested that he had extraordinary powers for 6 months, so he actually changed the constitution and laws and such. And then a referendum in 1958 took place, asking people whether they were on board with it. And like 82% of people said they were. So de Gaulle's popularity definitely lasted. And then during his time in office, he actually like got a lot of stuff done. So his main kind of policy was to develop Franco-German relations, because the last time a French leader made a state visit to Germany was Napoleon. So he really wanted to better this relationship, also because he was very much against trying to side with either the US or the USSR. He kind of wanted to create a new European superpower, and he thought that the development of this would bring back the glory of the French and German days. And he would also remove the dollar from their currency stalls, remove dollar reserves essentially, and trade it for gold to weaken American influence in France. So as like Western allies went, France was very much like, against, like relatively very much against the Americanization of the West. And then he did manage to solve the Algerian question. He essentially went over to them and he said, I think, je vous ai compris, I've understood you. And then the Pieds Noirs, who were the French settlers, thought that meant them. So they were happy. They actually turned out it meant the other people, they were not very happy. But he was kind of able to sidestep the demands of the Pieds Noirs and the kind of rebellious strain of the army. And essentially, he eventually managed to develop the Algerian economy and then offer independence to them. And eventually, it just worked out fine. And then throughout his term, throughout the 60s, he would lead France through the 30 Golden Record, which you can see is like the red line is the economic growth of France, and it's never been like as high since then. And yeah, that was basically his term as French president. So here are some quotes about Charles de Gaulle. Now, these are some of the ones I thought were not very he was a very controversial figure. Even though Western leaders loved him, they also hated him and despised him. because the Gaulle was he was very stubborn, very arrogant. But this is also like people would say these are his greatest qualities. I think, let's see. Well, yeah, I think these describe people's ambition. But then you have yeah, he was just he was definitely not loved by everyone. Closing remarks about his arrogance can be seen as his greatest strength. His arrogance meant that he thought he knew best, and luckily he did know best in a lot of situations, because if he didn't, he probably would have been as successful as boss. But that meant that he would push through on things such as pushing for himself to be the leader of France and accepting that he should be the savior of France in the late 50s to found the Fifth Republic. Like, his kind of mindset on these things meant that he was actually very successful. Of course, his patriotism meant, but also he would always put France first, which is one of the reasons why the Allies really didn't like him, because they were seeing the picture as like the threat that Germany posed to Europe, and he would always look at it as saying, how can we like save France essentially? But it helped France in the long term. He secured like the best deals possible he could for the French. Things like managing to get on the UN Council. France has like a much greater influence on the world than countries such as other Western countries like Spain, Portugal, because a lot of it is because of de Gaulle's measures. And he's definitely the most influential person on French politics because he helped to save France from the Nazis, and then he also founded the constitution on which modern France is built. So.
When looking at the belief,
well, I think my monocentre would be considered like centre, pretty much centre, maybe slightly centre right. Throughout like the 20th century, ways go against him. They didn't want him to be the president of France after the Fourth Republic. Obviously, the communists. So I think, by monocentre seems, like centre. Too sure. I think he just like really tried to focus on like pushing economy through, like developing stuff like that. Because he's always the focus on warfare. I think some of that mindset carried through his presidency because the 30 glorious years they ended with people's departure, and I think it's like it helps that it was only him leading, so that helped him put forward policies that would benefit the economy. And I think it's just also the war helps level stuff up, and he was able to just build up fresh ground.
I'll add to your talk. Thank you very much. It was such a detailed, so much information, such a detailed talk. Thank you very much for that. And witnessing so many years of impact on France, and not just on France, but also on the language. He was an ardent defender of the French language to the extent. Do you know the anecdote about the Concorde? Right, the plane, which we all know, the first of its kind, was the product of an alliance between the UK and France. And he was so adamant that this plane would have a French name. According to the British at the time on the project, it would have been called Concorde with no E, but he managed to get the E added to the name of the plane. that's just one anecdote. He was just adamant that the French language would be at the forefront still of
During the Second War, I think I read something like if he received the radio in English, he would get really angry. He'd ask to be told in French.
Absolutely, absolutely. And another anecdote, he was so tall, he was about 2 meters tall.
He was like 6.
Yeah, so there was, while he was president of France, there was a bed in all major hospitals in every region of France, a bed made for his size, just in case on his travels he would need hospitalization. A powerful man. Visiting the Sixth Form Library, I just came across this yesterday, only because I was looking at the shelves in the Sixth Form Library. Kind of unfortunately, it's all in French, but if you're that keen, maybe you will. I don't know. If you want a documentary, there's several documentaries on the Gaulle. There are 4 documentaries in stream. Documentaries which were made by the BBC, I believe. They are available on stream if you want to know a bit more, and if you want to see images. Yeah, yeah, 4 documentaries on stream. Okay, available to you. Thank you ever so much again. Thank you very much.